There will be an opportunity to ask questions after the panel have all spoken. So please think up your questions and get those ready. But please also feel free to put the questions into the chat at any time and engage in the discussion there. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to our first speaker, who is Gavin.
Well, thank you and good afternoon, everyone. Thanks very much for having me. It's always great to connect with the POGO community, the more so when it's one of my favourite topics, which is the role of civil society and the public in public procurement. I'm Gavin Hayman. I'm honoured to lead the Open Contracting Partnership, and it's our mission really to open up and transform public contracting and public procurement. We want to move it away from being a kind of box-ticking, compliance-based chore to really reinvent procurement as a smart digital public service. We aren't after just a bit more transparency about what government's buying. We want to drive fundamentally better outcomes. And engaging communities, citizens, and civic actors is absolutely central to that shift. Haven't got long to speak, so let me try and land 3 points with you as a framing. We're going to hear from other amazing speakers going to talk about particular projects and lessons learned and go into more detail. But really, I'm going to try and make 3 points. Involving citizens and the public in procurement is the right thing to do. Secondly, it's the smart thing to do. And thirdly, it's actually easier than you think. So, first point on it being the right thing to do. Really, procurement is like democracy in action. It's your taxes being spent in your community on the public good as shaped by your priorities. A lot of government policies and procedures are fairly abstract, but actually procurement really touches people's lives. It's the roads, the schools, and the hospitals that we all care about. And we're talking about huge sums of public money. In the UK, I think it's £300 billion per year. That's one in every £3 spent by the government. And it's vital that money is spent, but also seen to be spent in the public interest. And civic actors are absolutely crucial in checking, verifying, and trust building around that delivery. Organisations from civil society, journalists, and watchdogs provide the vital scrutiny that really government cannot provide and perform itself. You can look at procurement data, they can investigate potential red flags, they can unearth conflicts of interests, single bids awards, patterns of bad procurement, bad implementation of contracts where promises haven't been delivered, social value and other promises. And that external scrutiny can really help change the incentives and ideally build a consensus on how to better deliver these services in future. I'm going to put some examples in the chat when I finish speaking, because I can't multitask and do it all at once. But I'm going to give you a quick example in the chat from a BBC Newsnight investigation. So a classic example here of investigative journalism. It's a project we were honoured to contribute to by scraping some of the procurement data. It was looking at the provision of overnight emergency accommodation to vulnerable teenagers. And they found wildly different prices and really, really bad service delivery. Some of these kids were put in beds that didn't have room. So really shocking. As a result of that, the government issued new guidelines and a wholesale change in service delivery. So that's a kind of example. Another one would be a really great academic, rigorous study. There was a randomized control trial of civic monitoring of road building in Afghanistan. And it found the roads were of significantly higher quality when citizen monitors were involved in monitoring them. Interestingly, it improved the quality of the whole road, not just the bit that's been monitored. And they also found it was even more impactful if the government opened up specific channels for them to give feedback and to have their complaints heard and everything else. But it's rare to have a randomized control trial testing and proving this stuff, but it's a really good example of why it is the right thing to do. Let me talk about why it's the smart thing to do now. So procurement shapes the services people actually receive, and civil society, citizens, and other groups bring two vital things government buyers can often miss: technical expertise and lived experience, right? So opening up and working on procurement with civil society and others who are close to the problem you are can provide much better information on what to buy and how to buy it. The more so as we increasingly require procurement to address like urgent societal problems. We're trying to get to go green. We need to understand technologies. We need to understand what will work for communities. There's another great example I'm going to share with you and pop in the chat, which is about medical procurement, which is involving HIV patients groups in Ukraine. This amazing group called 100% Life convened patients groups to monitor and improve medical procurement. And they hugely reduced drug prices. And the end result was the Ukraine could treat twice as many HIV patients as before for the same budget. So I think it went from about 50,000 people to about 100,000. So really impactful sort of stuff. So it can be the smart thing to do. Let's talk about making it easier. So I completely understand the barriers and friction here. We're taking what I was saying is a very kind of closed, legalistic process like procurement. You're opening up feedback and collaboration. But the good news is there are loads of smart digital tools that can reduce that friction, really assemble the feedback in quite a smart and timely way, can help ensure a fair mediated process, can go beyond maybe talking to the usual suspects of very closely connected groups to actually talk to wider communities. And if you make an effort, you can reach out to more disadvantaged communities, particularly if you consult and design feedback loops with those communities to meet them where they are. Again, another great example from our work in Paraguay, in this case, an incredible civic monitoring organization called Reaccion takes complicated government procurement data around schools and uses that to engage students in actually monitoring delivery and fixes in their own classrooms. As a result of that, over time, something like 80% of the schools that are most in need of funding and support from the Special Education Fund now receive funding. It was only 20% when they started. So a real change in impact and service delivery. Another great example would be from Ukraine. There's the Pro-Zorro World Award-winning procurement reforms. There's a Do Zorro citizen monitoring program, which before the war had over 100,000 users with a really interesting fixed rate and loads of local stories of monitoring delivery. Everything from the failure to deliver a heating contract to a tower block here in the depths of Kiev winter, through to improving the Eurovision Song Contest stations and everything else. So really kind of impactful and thoughtful stuff. It does take time and care to build trust and engagement, and you have to reach people at the right time in the process where they can make a difference and the right way that meets them where they are. And you've got to work hard to build a community, and you've got to have clear structured channels for both citizens to have a voice, but also government to listen. But it can work and have a huge positive impact. So long story short, it's the right thing to do, it's the smart thing to do, and I think we can make it easier. Thank you very much for having me, and look forward to the discussion later.
Fantastic. Thank you, Gavin. Lisa, you're up next.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to bring perhaps a more personal view. As a civil servant working in the Cabinet Office, I'm the head of open and transparent contracting. And like Gavin, this is one of my absolute passions. So just to frame a little bit about how we see the purpose of public procurement and our responsibilities in it. So we're going to explore how transparency is that essential mechanism for upholding our responsibility in public procurement. And personally, I would like to express how our work with civil society, it supports this approach to scrutiny, participation and trust. So we're going to discuss how the Procurement Act and the new central digital platform were co-created with civil society and how this partnership has been key to driving ongoing accountability, ensuring we deliver the very best value for the citizen. So public procurement is far more than just buying goods and services. It's an economic driver, and its fundamental purpose is completely clear: to deliver the very best in terms of value and service for the citizen. So the power we hold in making multi-billion-pound decisions on behalf of the public is such a privilege. That privilege, however, puts a huge responsibility on buyers to act with the highest level of professionalism and integrity. This is, of course, where transparency comes in. So transparency is not just a bureaucratic overhead. It is the essential mechanism by which we uphold that responsibility and demonstrate to the public that we are acting with that professionalism and integrity. It allows citizens, civil society and suppliers to see how decisions are being made about spending public money, which is vital for building and maintaining the trust in the government decision making. This new framework did not just spring up in isolation. The Procurement Act was not built behind closed doors. Civil society played a crucial role in shaping its foundations through rigorous consultation and co-creation. And I don't think this is perhaps often spoken about or known, but we saw civil society influencing members of the House of Lords in huge passionate abundance during the passage through the House. An example would be the legislation now places an onus on the minister to provide a single central digital platform. That came in as a direct result of lobbying and quite a lot of behind the scenes discussion, and that really mustn't be underestimated. Of course, that brings us to where we are now. And I don't think we're at the end. I think we're just pausing for breath at the moment. There is continued ongoing work with civil society. And it's this next phase that's probably of most interest to the group. And what I'd like to do is hand over to my colleague, Lucy North, who's going to take you through some of our aspirations, hopes, and our next stages. Now, we have an act. We have an established method of working with civil society. Where do we go now, Lucy?
Thanks, Lisa. So as Lisa said, the Act was only really the start of our journey, and that next step was co-creating the data itself. And the data is collected through our notices, and they were co-designed with civil society to make sure we could get the data required to produce quality insights into our procurement activity. Now, those notices span across the entire procurement lifecycle, from planning the route to market and publishing a pipeline notice to that kind of ultimate termination of the contract at the end. We do recognise, however, this is a massive step change in public procurement practices, and as such, this is not an evolution. It's not a revolution, but an evolution. Our practitioners are learning how to use a new regime, get the best out of it, and establishing those best practices on a continual basis. And as they do so, they publish more data, and now we have a better picture of how we can actually further improve on a range of issues across data quality, data accessibility, and data insights. So we're working with the Open Contracting Partnership to ensure that the published data is good quality and, most importantly, useful for public scrutiny. Now, this commitment that we have to an ongoing process of improvement will enable us to build easy-to-access data applications, improve searches, and provide vital insights. Now, these data applications are simple, interactive components that transform that raw data into really rich stories. They'll allow users, for example, to use a contract overview to see where public money is being spent, or to use a pipeline overview to see public investment plans in their local area. Now, the whole purpose of these reforms is to improve the tools that the public has access to better share information and understand activity across the sector. These reforms will ultimately allow taxpayers to see how much is being spent through procurement in their local area, who it's being spent with, and is it delivering on local priorities that matter to them. As we went through this, user research was absolutely central to the design and build of the central digital platform. And as we build our data applications, that will be no different. Civil society is a key user of the procurement data that we produce, and their insight will be invaluable as we move into the next phase. Turning to focus now on the next steps and the role that civil society plays in shaping our future direction. For me, civil society is not only welcomed, but is an ongoing force for our continuous improvement. They're our critical friend and a vital sounding board to ensure we uphold our ambition for world-class transparency. That relationship is both informal, but also formalised through our Open Government National Action Plan, and our previous National Action Plans, numbers 5 and 6, focused on delivering that foundation of the Procurement Act, and we'll shortly be entering a new period of co-creation for the next National Action Plan. And we look forward to civil society leading the charge on what comes next. I think as we come to a close, it seems kind of appropriate at this moment to remind everyone of our original transparency ambition, that one of the goals of the procurement bill is to create a fully transparent procurement system, where we want everyone from citizens to ministers, large companies to sole traders, to be able to view, search, and understand what the UK public sector buys, how much it's spending, and with whom. This ambition absolutely remains, and we look forward to continued work with civil society to work on the realisation of this ambition, building upon the foundations we've already laid as we've got here.
Fantastic. Thank you, Lisa and Lucy. Bojana's next, I think.
Yes, thank you, Anne. Good afternoon, everyone. It is a pleasure to take part in today's POGO session. I'm Bojana Todorovic, a lecturer at the University of Belgrade Faculty of Law in Serbia. And today I bring a comparative and academic perspective to this topic. I will briefly reflect on an somewhat exotic legal institute of civil oversight in public procurement. Exotic in the sense that, to the best of my knowledge, no European country recognizes a similar instrument of civil society oversight in public procurement, albeit similar instruments, similar mechanisms can be found in the legislation of certain Latin American, Asian, and African countries. So, given the short time to present this institute, I will briefly reflect on who the civil supervisor was, why I said was and not is, and what the main role of this institute, as envisaged by the Serbian legislator at the time, was. The law on public procurement from 2012 that was in force until 2020, the 1st of July 2020, introduced what we can say is an experiment when it comes to enhancing transparency and integrity in public procurement by envisaging a mandatory appointment of representatives of the civil society, individuals and organizations that are experts in the field of public procurement and or the fight against corruption and conflict of interests to oversee the most valuable public procurement procedures, more specifically, public procurement procedures whose financial value exceeded a financial threshold of 1 billion Serbian dinars, and the equivalent today would the equivalent in euros today would be around 8.5 million euros. Now, these representatives of the civil society, apart from being experts, had to be completely independent and impartial. And the crux of their role in the public procurement procedures they were overseeing was to observe all the phases of the procurement cycle from its initiation until the conclusion of the contract, the awarded contract, or the termination of the procedure, and to report on what has been seen in all of these phases. So, the key competences included access to documentation, including documentation that preceded the formal initiation of the public procurement procedure, as well as an obligation to prepare and present before a competent public procurement body, as well as a competent parliamentary assembly, this report, and also inform the public about identified irregularities throughout the process. Now, in one of the articles I wrote on the dedicated to the civil supervisor in Serbian public procurement law, I talked about a missed opportunity to strengthen civic control in public procurement. And I will clarify why. The efficiency of this legal institute was weakened due to the scarcity of the legal framework, in the sense that some crucial questions were not regulated, such as questions related to the appointment, or fully regulated to the appointment of the civil supervisor in a particular public procurement procedure, questions related to remuneration for their work, as well as specificities related to the way of reporting. Apart from this, the civil society in Serbia struggled with a lack of capacities to fulfill this important task, responsible task. And finally, they were tasked with an incredibly responsible role in an environment that was politically and institutionally highly unfavorable, sometimes even hostile. Now, despite this, I believe, and the fact that the pertinent law on public procurement does not recognize this institute anymore, why I believe this was in the end a successful experiment and something that should be considered in the future, in considering the revision of public oversight mechanisms in public procurement, because one of the instruments at the disposal of civil supervisors was legal standing in review procedures. So in addition to aggrieved bidders, in addition to competent public authorities such as the state audit institution or the state attorney, who had the possibility of instigating the review mechanism, representatives of the civil society performing the role of civil supervisor also had this opportunity. And in more cases than one, this enabled the instigation of review procedures and unearthed cases of serious malfeasance in the most valuable public procurement projects that never would have happened had this review mechanism not envisaged the possibility of civil society representatives to take part in it. And to conclude, I will reflect on something Anne mentioned in the beginning, that public procurement is an area where there is a clear tension between public and private interests. I fully agree with that, and I believe that civil society is uniquely positioned to sort of balance between the tension of public and private interests, and by granting them standing in review procedures and review mechanisms, I think it is possible to push public authorities, especially contracting authorities, to consider public interests more seriously and with more accountability in public procurement procedures. And more specifically, by public interests, I refer to criteria related to environmental and social sustainability that are crucial in large infrastructure projects, for example, and that are particularly at risk in environments where corruption is deeply rooted in public procurement systems. And with that, I will conclude. And if there are any questions related to this, I would be happy to discuss this more. Thank you.
Fascinating. Thank you very much indeed. Jasmina, it's over to you.
Hello, POGO community. Lovely to be with you this afternoon. I'm Jasmina Haynes. I'm CEO of Integrity Action, which is UK-based charity. We have supported citizens in over 20 countries monitor over $1 billion worth of products and services, typically public products and services, usually from the beginning of the procurement to the community level delivery. And out of all projects monitored and problems identified by citizens, about 70% of them get to be resolved within 12 months. So, that's 70% of problems solved is something that I would like to focus on in this conversation, and it directly links to Gavin's third point, that it's easier than you think. I would say it's easier than you think, and there are so many examples of successful methodologies and tools being implemented around the world. So don't worry, it's absolutely possible to do it when governments put their minds into making it happen. I want to give you our three key learning points. The first one is open an opportunity for citizens, and they will do it. But they won't do it spontaneously. They need to be supported and guided. And that's where I see the full role of civil society to come into play. I can see in questions that Charles is asking about how do you differentiate between monitoring against bills of quantities on very complex programs versus what civil society and citizens are interpreting as good and valuable, and their interpretation of quality. Charles, I can talk a lot more to that point, and that too is possible, and we have multiple examples of how it can be done, both from Integrity Action and from other organizations. The second learning point is fixes when things don't go right can happen, and they usually happen really fast. Those 70% of problems resolved in our work have materialized within maximum of 12 months of citizen monitoring, but 30% of problems that get to be unresolved are equally valuable because they point you to very difficult, usually legislative obstacles that are preventing effective delivery on community level. Third point is, and Caroline in the chat has touched on that, let's not assume that there is capacity and capability within civil society. Absolutely spot on point. But let's not also assume that people working for governments know how to include citizens and work with civil society. So capacity building and trust building amongst all these stakeholders is an incredibly important point. And I'll leave you with that.
Wonderful. Thank you very much indeed. Sarah, you are up next.
Great. Thank you so much for having me. It's really, really wonderful to be here and to be able to discuss this really important topic. I am at the Tao Center for Digital Journalism at Columbia University in New York. So my angle into this is through the lens of the role of journalism and other civic information providers, which I think kind of follows on very nicely from what's already been said by the panel. Because journalists have a very important role to play in engaging the public and civil society in the procurement process. One of the cornerstones of public engagement is access to information. And journalists are uniquely positioned to translate what can often be complex information, as has been discussed in the chat, and data into stories that can make them more accessible. So that's a really important sort of mediation role. Journalists also have investigative skills that position them well to track down information that people in power might not want exposed. One need only to look at OCP's most recent newsletter to see examples of the role of journalists. In the Philippines, for example, journalists have played a key role in exposing corruption around flood management and exposing officials lining the pockets of favored companies using non-existent ghost projects, the culmination of which has led to an open government renaissance of sorts there. In Serbia, journalists have uncovered millions of euros worth of no-bid contracts, an investigation which resulted in harassment and surveillance campaigns against the journalists, which, as a side note, this is an example of what I call discordant impact, or sort of unintended impact, because I think it's important when tracking impact, as so many civil society organizations do, and increasingly procurement does, to acknowledge not only the desired or accordant impact, but also the undesired impact on those who undertake these efforts. In Germany, journalists have found that one company received nearly half of the 100 billion euro that the government invested in defense and security. So journalists are key to uncovering wrongdoing and engaging the public in those ways. And then one other element that is important to highlight is collaboration, not only between journalism outlets, but between journalism and civil society organizations like NGOs. And I think that's also going to be something going forward that is going to be even more sort of codified in these types of situations. In 2022, in a 2022 report, I termed the collaboration between journalism and civil society organizations cross-field collaboration. I'll post the link shortly. And I think especially in countries like the US that have a tradition of journalistic neutrality and objectivity, it's really important to show the journalism field how they can collaborate with civil society organizations while still maintaining that independence, because those collaborations have the potential for enormous impact. So I will leave it there and look forward to the discussion.
Wonderful. Thank you very much indeed, Sarah. And Zarino is our final panelist.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm not sure how I can follow up on all these speakers, and I think I might be repeating a few of the excellent points that have already been made. I'm Zarino from My Society. We're the UK charity behind websites like They Work For You, What Do They Know, Fix My Street. And we run these digital services that break down the barriers to democratic participation. And as Gavin said earlier, I think public scrutiny of public spending is a big part of that. And sometimes that scrutiny, as Sarah was just saying, happens via journalists and researchers. And we've seen lots of evidence of that. We try to keep a track on it on our services. We track citations in What Do They Know and case studies on our blog. There's lots of examples I could have pulled out of data, government data, often procurement data, being opened up via What Do They Know. But to pick one example, an oldie but a goodie, a 2019 report from the Bureau of Investigative Journalism into government data systems. I'll post a link in the chat. There you go for that. They FOI'd a sample of authorities via What Do They Know, requesting audit trails of G-Cloud procurements, and almost half either didn't respond or refused the request for various reasons. And overall, the picture was just a shocking lack of rigour and evaluation around digital procurement. And they wrote a really good report about that based on those FOIs. And this was in 2019, before the AI boom. So it makes you wonder what sort of snake oil is currently being purchased inside organisations now. And I think transparency around, especially automated decision making, is something we're interested in here at My Society at the moment. Whether that's procurement of especially explicitly AI tools, or sort of AI through the back door bundled into other services in an even less transparent, accountable way. I know there was a recent POGO Club session about this a few months ago, so if people haven't watched the video from that, they should go back and watch it. It was really good. I think a final thing I'll mention is that sometimes, as well as the journalism side, scrutiny happens via the citizens themselves. So one of my hats at My Society is heading up our climate team, and the Committee for Climate Change estimated that about a third of emissions in the UK are within the influence of local authorities. And the big things that councils procure, like waste management and vehicle fleets and buildings, have big emissions costs. So we wanted to explore how we could provide more visibility of those costs. And we ran some workshops in 2021 and identified a need from citizens and local campaign groups around contributing to procurement exercises well in advance of when the procurement actually opens up. Because sometimes these massive procurement contracts last for 5 or 10 years. So if you want to get in at the start and influence your council's decision, you need to start years in advance of the tender coming up. And so we prototyped a tool called Contract Countdown, which I can also post in the chat. There's a link to all of the prototyping we did, and there's links to some of the prototypes. Using open contracting data to show a list of expiring contracts for each local authority, sorted by the amount of time left to get involved, and an estimated carbon impact as well of that contract based on what it was, the category, the wording, using some magical experimental work from our friends at Spend Network. And we got really positive feedback on this. It obviously demystified procurement stuff for citizens and campaigners, but we got surprisingly positive feedback from council climate officers and councillors themselves too. Especially in large councils, you might have separate organisations and departments within the council that have no idea what's being procured or what the government's, the council's strategy is in other areas of the council. So it was a massive increase to that visibility. Ultimately, sadly, with this prototype, the data was pretty tricky to keep on top of. I'm sure I don't need to tell people on this call how messy procurement data often is. And we struggled to find a way to make it kind of financially self-sustaining. So that one's on the back burner right now. But if anyone on this call is interested in talking more, post a message in the chat. I see that my time is almost up. So hopefully that gives you an idea of services like ours and how they can kind of break down those barriers around procurement data and hook up a bit of action between councils or authorities, citizens, the people within and outside, and as Sarah was saying, journalists and researchers too. Anyway, happy to answer any questions.
Fantastic, thank you. And very impressive multitasking as well during that talk. I can't talk and post at the same time, so very impressed by that. Great, okay, so now an opportunity for members of the audience to ask questions. I see there's been a nice little discussion going in the chat, which we might ask our panelists to address when we come back to them, around expertise and knowledge and the sort of capacity of civil society organisations to engage with more technical questions. So we can come back to that. Any other questions and thoughts out there? You can turn your camera on and wave at me, or you can raise your little electronic hand, or pop something in the chat if that's not working. I'm sensing a lack of civil society participation here. Sarah, do you want to come in?
Sure, and I saw someone else as well, just wave as well. But I just wanted to comment on the data bit, because I think as well for journalists, in terms of translating what's going on, the open data, accessible data, clean data is so crucial. And I know both sides of it from my research. Both producing clean data is incredibly difficult, and cleaning data that is messy is incredibly difficult. So I really sympathize with both sides of this equation. I think that it's just, especially with the technology that we have now, the access that's possible, AI, making data accessible, cleaning it up, and then having like the ability for perhaps, sort of tutorials or something like that, where both journalists and civil society can learn how to make the best access of it. I think it's absolutely crucial.
Thank you for that. Who was waving? Caroline was waving. I can see you now.
Yeah, thanks. Sorry about that. My technical incompetence knows no bounds, and I can't find the raise hand sign. Bojana was talking, I thought, very interestingly about civil society participation in complaints or challenges or bid protest or whatever they're called. And I think that raises a really interesting point. When we were looking at this in answer trial, I should declare an interest. I was involved with that. There was very strong pushback against having that from many UN member states, because it was thought that that would just gum up the procurement process. And there were some countries that said we have far too many complaints, and other countries said we don't have enough. And I was just wondering, just a general question out there, has anybody been involved with discussions along those lines? Just because, in some countries where there's quite an activist base, just about every procurement might be challenged. Thanks.
Great question. Thank you, Caroline. We'll get our panelists to address that shortly. Anybody else want to come in? For my part, I have a question. I have a predictable lawyer question, which is, what scope do you think there is or should be for civil society organisations to seek judicial review of procurement decisions? So I think we've been talking about participation in more general terms, and I'm wondering about specifically using legal processes to try and challenge decision making in this space. I know a little bit about what goes on in the UK, but I'm interested to hear about any other jurisdictions that you know as well, and what you think is going on there and what you think should be going on, whether that's a useful route or a distraction. Any other questions people would like to raise before we go back to our panel? Rory.
Thanks very much. I'm curious about examples where civil society organizations have been involved and they're not procurement nerd organizations. It strikes me that there are lots of goals and missions focused on wide-ranging things like getting people homes, getting people jobs, dealing with the environment. And I'm curious about mechanisms to bring in more civil society organizations that are focused directly on housing people, on getting people jobs, on addressing climate change. That we just a really nice example there from My Society about engaging people around climate change. But I'm curious about other examples where or other mechanisms to try and bring in organizations that are more directly related to or focused on those missions, and not necessarily organizations that have grown up, focused on procurement data.
Great question, thank you. Kevin?
Hi, my name is Kevin Keith. I'm chair of the UK Government Network. I think what's really exciting about the work that's taking place in the UK is that it's actually taken place over quite a number of years, over a number of political cycles too. It's been multiple national action plans, each moving the conversation forward. To me, it's kind of moved from policy-led to culture-led. I think that's very much what I'm hearing on this call today from both government and civil society voices. And I suppose my question is really, what's the trick? How are you working so effectively, collaboratively together? What are the challenges that you've overcome? And any advice you have for other reformers who work a lot with government in this way?
Fantastic, thank you. Great question and a good challenge, I think. I'm going to go back round our panelists now. Each of you have a couple of minutes to respond to what you've heard from fellow panelists, to any of the questions that particularly take your fancy. Please feel free again to drop thoughts into the chat if you don't have time to cover everything. And we'll go back in the same order. So Gavin, you get first pick.
Gosh, what an amazing set of questions. So just one on, there was a reflection on how to improve the information. And in reality, there's the long route to accountability, which is you put the information out there, people use that information to drive change, and they kind of civil society pick up with it. Equally as important is to get government to use the information itself to do things better right from the start. So I think that shorter route to accountability of working with governments, the government gets good visibility on the data, which means they care about the data quality. They don't break the open data pipe or anything else, and they just enter random digits and numbers, because it's really important for them to do their jobs better. We were hearing from My Society about that, about how actually giving councils back their own planning information to tell them what was upcoming was incredibly helpful. And I think that's going to be the really valuable trick in the culture shift that Kevin was asking about, where local authorities get back their own UK procurement information. So transparency doesn't feel extractive, is actually helping do their jobs better. And that means the data quality will be really good, which will improve the external accountability loops as well. So I think that's my kind of reflection on that whole thing. Charles in the chat was raising this great question about you have to give training and support to civil society. You have to redesign and think through the way people are going to monitor things. And Rory, you were asking about it has to touch people's lives in a substantial and meaningful way to get them to care, right? It's not just so if it's HIV patients, you can bet they really care about medicines procurement, because they literally said having HIV in Ukraine was a death sentence, right? They're no joking. It's one of the lines from the story they were talking about, and it was incredible looking at the inefficiencies. So buying one 10 milligram tablet was more than twice as expensive as 2 5 milligrams. There's lots of quite simple things that were tangible and credible that patients could imagine and follow. The same drug bought generically versus expensive brands. It's really thinking that through and thinking through that, making it accessible, and just a huge respect to My Society and Integrity Action and others who do that work on a day-to-day basis around particular issues. So that's my kind of key reflections, I think. I'll come back as any other questions I've missed there. Thanks.
Great, thank you very much. Lisa or Lucy or both?
Oh, hi, thank you. I'd like to respond to Mr. Keith's question about how do we do it, because this is actually a conversation that we're having internally at the moment as we start to think about the end of one nap and the the approach of the next, is how do we continue to do this? So I think for us, there's a bit of magic sauce in personality, and actually taking the time to get to know people and understand their motivations and drivers and build trust. So trust has been a really important part from our side of being able to be in an environment where we can have some quite challenging conversations sometimes. So there has to be trust. With that, there has to be openness. But I think the thing that I experienced most as we went through the bill most recently was the ability to understand the constraints of the other party. So we generally all work in this environment because we have, I don't know, allied beliefs or some commonality of direction. But the machines that we work within are quite different, and actually understanding how that machine works and what the constraints of it are, I think went a huge way towards us having relationships with civil society that we certainly celebrate very much, and continue to build on. But I'm really interested in the question because I'm always learning, and if civil society can add more to that, brilliant. I'd love to learn.
Great, thank you very much. Bojana, I think you're next in the running order.
Yes, thank you. I'm incredibly happy to see that in the chat we have a comment from a representative of one of the civil society organizations in Serbia that actually performed the role of civil supervisor. We could see what, from the perspective of someone who actually performed this sort of oversight, were the main problems regarding this institute. Now, I will briefly try to reflect on what has been said, some of the questions asked, as well as the questions from the chat. The way I see this institute that I talked about, that ultimately failed in the sense that it was not included in the pertinent legislation on public procurement, but I think has a lot of potential that was unused, is the role of civil society in this case was, I think, we could observe it from two levels. On the one hand, there is participation in the procedure and oversight of the procedure of the public procurement procedures in order to enhance transparency, ensure integrity of the public procurement process by enhancing transparency and reporting. And I think in order for civil society to conduct this role successfully, as having an explicit legal mandate or being voluntarily involved in such procedures, I think there needs to be what Lisa mentioned earlier, trust between the public sector and civil society, which is difficult in environments such as the Serbian one. And I think there was ultimately a lack of trust, fully understandable, between the contracting authorities, a lot of contracting authorities, and the civil society sector. And I think the situation regarding that is even worse at the moment. On the other hand, I think, and perhaps because, and especially in environments where trust is at a low level, where public institutions are reluctant to instigate public enforcement mechanisms in the protection of the public interest, even when such mechanisms are a possibility provided by law, and where economic operators or aggrieved bidders do not have an interest for whatever reason, I think granting standing to civil society representatives is crucial. I think a crucial step towards improving not only the integrity of public procurement procedures, but also ensuring that sustainability requirements are complied with. It doesn't ensure that this will be the case, but I think it is an important precondition when we have a situation like the one described in the chat, that reports of civil society and remarks by civil society representatives were not taken into account or were completely ignored by contracting authorities. And there was a question that Anne raised, whether granting civil society members, representatives of the civil society, access to review procedures, whether before specialized administrative bodies and or the judiciary in order to challenge decisions of the contracting authority is a useful route or is a distraction. I think it will always be considered a distraction from the perspective of public authorities, whether for reasons related to serious problems of procurement systems, such as deeply rooted corruption, or because it simply slows the development of and implementation of procurement projects. But I think it is an important and useful route for observing public interests. Not the only one, like I said, but I think it is important. But again, a precondition for that is a well-developed mechanism, which I think was not legally, normatively well-developed mechanism that takes into account that procurements are highly technical at times, highly specialized, and there needs to be a focus on training civil society representatives in order to be able to perform that task and actually recognize malfeasance in public procurement.
Thank you very much indeed. Yasmina, any reflections from you?
Yeah, few reflections, and Rory, we definitely fit the bill of organization that's not a procurement nerd, and we work with a whole network of civil society organizations who will be thematically focused on specific services delivery, for example, mental health or environmental organizations and etc. And where we come into play, we bring technology and methodologies in place to enable them to really mobilize citizens who they work for to monitor how procurement products and services are delivered in their communities. And a couple of people have mentioned it. Citizens have to have, I think it was Gavin, highly vested interest in monitoring of those services. If there is a primary school being built in community and you have a child of primary school age, you will volunteer your hours to make sure that that school is built as intended. And what I think is very important, and it's come through a couple of points in the chat about whether monitoring by citizens and civil society can become too much. Can it become too focused on issues and problems and focused on whistleblowing? There are so many organizations around the world, including the one that I work for, that can prove that there are methodologies that provide actionable insights to procurement agents and to companies delivering those products and services, and effectively separating them from softer feedback from communities. And an example would be construction of schools, for example, in Armenia, where citizens have even taken samples of cement, taken it for testing to double check whether it fits what was described in Bill of Quantities. Taking a sample of cement is not a rocket science. You need to be there when it's poured, and you need to have someone who will provide and pay for services, testing services by an independent institute. And I think we shouldn't be focused on, oh my word, citizens are going to bring so much information, so many views to the table, and this is going to be a nightmare to tell, who's telling the truth, and how do you separate their emotions from actually what's being built into procurement documents. Citizens can, if they're supported by civil society, they can easily separate the two. And by separating the two, you also enable them to be part of solution. So there's no government in this world who has enough money to deliver goods and services on community level that meet all the needs of everybody in society. That's never going to happen. But if you have that bond of trust between government and citizens, once they're informed, they're supported, they will find solutions to procurement problems that government will never have money to provide. And that could be, for example, allowing access across the land that they own, Or in Africa, we see loads of examples where communities are dusting off, for example, solar panels off health centers. Otherwise, those solar panels will stop working in a matter of weeks. When it comes to community views, I think they're not nuisance, but you would expect someone who comes from civil society to say that. There's a lot of power in there that can inform good future procurement. There are loads of products and services that are delivered that are really not money well spent, but it sounded so good to someone sitting in London or some regional office somewhere who just anticipated that this will be welcomed and by communities, but communities can tell you whether they would rather have this or that for the same amount of money. They can guide their decision making. There are a couple of comments about, but how do you bring this whole ecosystem in balance? That's where transparency comes into play. All the data collected by citizens has to be available on open platform and available to journalists, to anyone sitting anywhere from any trade, any background. That way, you stop the opportunity of data manipulation, for example. And very importantly, it brings this benefit that you nudge all stakeholders in the chain to resolve problems. And that's the bottom line. I think we're all sick and tired in our lives of people bringing problems in front of us. It's so amazing when those problems get to be resolved. And I think that's what we should all think about. One thing, and I think this links to the point raised by Miloš in the chat, let's not forget the squeeze on civil society. Civil society is not panacea. We're under massive financial pressures. We're losing people, good people, who no longer can afford to work for civil society, where everything was always traditionally done on a shoestring budget in our space, but look at us now. So think about how to fund civil society. Where is the support? Where is the encouragement? Where is what is it that you and your institutions can do to encourage that ecosystem, because it's essentially an important part of democracy.
Great, thank you. Sarah, some closing reflections from you?
Sure, great. This is such a wonderful conversation. It could go on forever, but I will just say very briefly, I think that's worth flagging in the context of the US that this whole project depends on to some extent the government being either complying or collaborating in the sense of being willing to collect the data, being willing to provide the data publicly. And unfortunately, in the US at the federal level at the moment, we have a very disheartening situation, right? Where data is not even being collected anymore in some cases and delayed or not provided. And there are private organizations stepping in and civil society stepping in, but I think that's an important sort of prerequisite that's worth flagging. But I would also say that, and again, I can speak mostly with the most confidence about the US, but at the local level, meaning at the city and state level, there are some really interesting things happening, which I know like Gavin's organization has been involved with, My Society, I think as well, and others. So, and that brings in like unusual, maybe perhaps unusual collaborators. And Yasmina, I think your point is very well taken, that when someone has like a little bit of skin in the game, they're willing to do things that they might not otherwise do in terms of monitoring and data collection and that sort of thing. The ability of journalists to provide value in as infomediaries, as I saw in the chat, which I love, depends on them being sustainable and them being solvent, and that's a whole nother issue. But thank you so much for having me today. I'll close up with that.
Thank you very much indeed. Zarina, any final thoughts from you?
Yeah, I've just posted a quick summary in the chat with a link to another example of procurement action from non-procurement nerds. I think the one thing I'd pull out of what I posted there is that I think there's a lot of scope for organisations that are interested in a particular angle to use procurement as a lever to get this information about what public authorities are up to. There's two problems and challenges that we all need to try and help them overcome, though. One is understanding when they've actually been affected by procurement decisions and how to start on that journey. And the other is building their confidence. We ran a program with some JRCT funding recently, upskilling community organisations that represent marginalised communities, and it was really frightening for them submitting their first FOI request to ask what's happening inside these authorities. And I can understand why, like there are big power imbalances in place. So I think the more that can be proactively published, that will help with that kind of thing. But if people are having to go digging, then we need to try and give them the tools to do that too.
Fantastic. Thank you very much indeed. What a great panel. What a rich discussion on a really important topic. Thank you so much, everyone, for a really fantastic session. Please keep an eye on your inboxes. We're plotting further POGO sessions for the new year. Because I think on the last Tuesday in December, we might all be otherwise occupied chilling out. So please keep an eye out for further announcements. We're going to finish the session formally now and finish the recording.